January 17, 1991. 40,000 feet above the Iraqi desert, two experimental Boeing E-8A aircraft circled the night sky, their radar arrays scanning hundreds of square kilometers of hostile territory in real time. Inside the fuselages, Air Force and Army operators stared at radar screens displaying a truth that would shatter Iraqi confidence. Every tank, every supply convoy, every artillery battery repositioning under cover of darkness was visible, tracked, and marked for destruction. The Republican Guard commanders who had relied on nighttime maneuver for generations believed they were invisible. They were wrong. The Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System had arrived, and ground warfare would never be the same again. For decades, military doctrine had operated on a fundamental assumption: ground forces could reposition under darkness, using terrain and weather to mask their movements from enemy observation. Night belonged to the defender. Commanders who moved armored divisions after sunset could avoid airstrikes, consolidate forces, and establish defensive positions without exposure. Iraqi Republican Guard officers, trained in Soviet combined arms doctrine and hardened by 8 years of war with Iran, understood this principle deeply. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was the product of experience. They had maneuvered divisions at night for years, evading Iranian reconnaissance aircraft and surviving in an environment where concealment meant survival. When coalition air operations began on January 17, Iraqi ground commanders expected what every military force had known for a century. Air superiority over the battlefield meant danger during daylight, but nightfall would offer sanctuary. They planned accordingly. Republican Guard tank battalions and mechanized infantry brigades received orders to remain static during the day, dug into defensive positions along the Kuwait-Saudi border, and to reposition only after dark. Supply convoys would move under moonless skies. Artillery batteries would displace to alternate firing positions between midnight and dawn. Radar operators in Baghdad and Basra believed their ground forces were executing textbook defensive doctrine, invisible to American reconnaissance, immune to precision targeting. They did not know that two aircraft, still in the experimental phase of development and rushed to the theater at the personal request of General Norman Schwarzkopf, were watching everything they did. JSTARS was not supposed to be operational, it was a prototype. Congress had forced the Air Force and Army to merge two separate development programs in the early 1980s, creating a joint surveillance platform that combined airborne synthetic aperture radar with ground-based analysis stations. The system had never been deployed in combat. Its reliability was unproven. Its operators were test engineers, not seasoned intelligence analysts. Yet on December 19, 1990, General Schwarzkopf sat through a briefing on JSTARS capabilities and immediately demanded its deployment. He had requested it earlier in the summer, then canceled the order, concerned that an immature system would fail under operational pressure. But by December, the coalition faced a strategic problem: how to locate and destroy Iraq's Republican Guard divisions, the elite armored force that Saddam Hussein considered his strategic reserve and the ultimate guarantor of regime survival. Traditional reconnaissance could not solve the problem. Satellite passes were predictable. High-altitude photography was limited by weather and darkness. Tactical reconnaissance aircraft were vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. Human intelligence was sparse and unreliable. What CENTCOM needed was a system that could watch the entire Kuwaiti theater of operations continuously, track every vehicle movement in real time, distinguish between stationary and moving targets, and provide targeting data to strike aircraft within minutes of detection. JSTARS could do all of this. On January 12, 1991, two E-8A aircraft and 5 ground station modules arrived in Saudi Arabia. 2 days later, JSTARS flew its first mission. It was supposed to be an engineering test flight, a systems check to verify that radar data could downlink correctly to ground stations. It became an 8-tower intelligence-gathering operation that changed the course of the war. The E-8A platform itself was a modified Boeing 707 airliner, chosen for its long endurance and spacious fuselage. Mounted beneath the aircraft was a 24-foot side-looking phased array radar capable of detecting moving targets across an area exceeding 20,000 square kilometers. The system operated in 2 modes: moving target indicator, which tracked vehicles in motion, and synthetic aperture radar, which produced high-resolution images of stationary targets. Both Air Force and Army operators flew on board, analyzing the same real-time radar data but interpreting it differently. Air Force controllers focused on immediate targeting, tracking moving convoys and directing strike aircraft to intercept them. Army operators manipulated the data to identify patterns, predict enemy movements, and assess the broader operational picture. This dual-perspective analysis proved critical. While Air Force operators could vector an F-15E Strike Eagle toward a moving Iraqi armor column within minutes, Army analysts could predict where that column was headed, identify its parent unit, and assess whether the movement indicated a larger offensive operation. Iraqi commanders had no idea they were being watched. Their radar networks, built around Soviet-designed early warning systems, were optimized to detect high-altitude bombers and fast-moving fighters. They were not designed to track a single reconnaissance aircraft orbiting at 40,000 feet, 200 kilometers away from the border. JSTARS did not need to penetrate Iraqi airspace. Its radar could see deep into Kuwait and southern Iraq from the safety of Saudi skies. The system's moving target indicator could detect a single vehicle moving at walking speed. It could distinguish between a tank and a truck based on radar signature. It could count the number of vehicles in a convoy, track their speed and heading, and predict their destination. For the first time in military history, a ground commander could watch an enemy armored division reposition in real time, as if observing pieces on a chessboard. The first major test came on January 29, when Iraqi armored units launched a surprise offensive against the Saudi border town of Khafji. It was Iraq's only significant ground offensive of the war, a multi-brigade assault intended to seize Saudi territory, inflict casualties on coalition forces, and demonstrate that the Republican Guard was still capable of offensive action. Iraqi commanders believed they had achieved tactical surprise. They had moved 3 mechanized brigades south under cover of darkness, avoiding coalition air patrols, and struck Khafji with overwhelming force. Coalition ground units, including Saudi Arabian and Qatari forces, fell back under heavy fire. For a few hours it appeared that Iraq had seized the initiative. Then JSTARS began tracking every Iraqi unit involved in the offensive. Operators aboard the E-8A watched as Iraqi armored columns converged on Khafji, identified reinforcement routes, and most critically confirmed that no additional Iraqi units were moving south to support the attack. This intelligence was decisive. Coalition commanders had initially feared that the Khafji assault was the opening phase of a larger offensive, a strategic push designed to disrupt the coalition's planned ground campaign. JSTARS data proved otherwise. The attack was isolated, limited to the units already engaged, with no follow-on forces moving into position. This allowed coalition commanders to commit forces to retake Khafji without disrupting the broader campaign plan. More importantly, JSTARS detected Iraqi resupply convoys attempting to reinforce the Khafji garrison. Coalition strike aircraft intercepted these convoys, destroying 70% of the vehicles and scattering the rest. Without resupply, the Iraqi garrison in Khafji was isolated and vulnerable. Within 48 hours, Saudi and Qatari forces, supported by U.S. Marine artillery and airstrikes, retook the town. The Battle of Khafji became a demonstration of JSTARS' strategic value. A single surveillance platform had provided the intelligence necessary to defeat an enemy offensive and prevent a potential disaster. As the air campaign continued, JSTARS missions evolved from experimental testing to continuous operational deployment. The 2 E-8A aircraft flew 49 consecutive missions, most of them at night, tracking Iraqi ground movements and providing targeting data to coalition strike aircraft. The system proved particularly effective against Iraqi efforts to preserve the Republican Guard divisions, which Saddam Hussein had ordered to withdraw from Kuwait before the coalition ground offensive began. Iraqi commanders attempted to execute a fighting withdrawal, moving armored units north at night to avoid airstrikes. JSTARS tracked every movement. Coalition strike aircraft, guided by real-time JSTARS data, intercepted retreating Republican Guard columns on the highways north of Kuwait City, destroying hundreds of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery pieces in what became known as the Highway of Death. Iraqi forces attempting to move cross-country fared no better. JSTARS synthetic aperture radar could detect vehicle tracks in the desert sand, identify staging areas, and guide strike aircraft to targets that would have been invisible to conventional reconnaissance. The technical achievement behind JSTARS was decades in the making. The concept originated in the 1970s when both the Air Force and Army recognized the need for a long-range, all-weather, day and night intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. The Army's program, known as SOTAS, envisioned a helicopter-mounted radar for tracking moving ground targets. The Air Force program Pave Mover proposed a fixed-wing aircraft with side-looking radar for deep battlefield surveillance. both programs face funding shortfalls and technical challenges. In the early 1980s, Congress intervened, ordering the two services to merge their efforts into a single joint program. The result was JSTARS, a system that combined the Army's tactical focus on ground targeting with the Air Force's strategic emphasis on deep interdiction. Development proceeded slowly through the 1980s, hampered by software challenges, radar integration problems, and inter-service disputes over operational control. By 1990, the program had produced 2 prototype aircraft and a handful of ground stations, but the system remained unproven in combat. The decision to deploy JSTARS to Desert Storm was a calculated risk. The aircraft were prototypes, lacking many components that would be included in the production model. The operators were test engineers, not combat-trained intelligence analysts. The system had never been tested in a high-threat environment, and there were legitimate concerns that Iraqi electronic warfare capabilities could jam or spoof the radar. Yet General Schwarzkopf's instinct proved correct. JSTARS not only worked, it exceeded every expectation. Brigadier General John Stewart, the G2 intelligence officer for Army Central Command, later stated unequivocally, the JSTARS was the single most valuable intelligence and targeting collection system in Desert Storm. JSTARS was instrumental in making every key read during the ground war. Air Force Chief of Staff General Merrill McPeak went further, predicting, "We will not ever again want to fight without a JSTARS kind of system." The impact on Iraqi ground doctrine was profound and immediate. Republican Guard commanders trained to maneuver under cover of darkness discovered that nighttime offered no sanctuary. Coalition strike aircraft appeared without warning, destroying convoys that Iraqi officers believed were invisible. Artillery batteries displaced at night were tracked, targeted, and destroyed before they could fire. Tank battalions moving to alternate defensive positions were intercepted mid-movement, caught in the open with no cover. Iraqi soldiers began to fear movement itself. Units that attempted to reposition suffered catastrophic losses. Units that remained static became easier targets for daytime airstrikes. The psychological effect was devastating. Iraqi commanders lost confidence in their ability to control the battlefield. Orders to move were met with hesitation, knowing that movement meant detection and detection meant destruction. After the war, coalition intelligence analysts conducted extensive debriefs with captured Iraqi officers. The testimony revealed a force paralyzed by the realization that American surveillance had rendered traditional ground maneuver obsolete. One Republican Guard division commander described the experience as fighting an invisible enemy who could see everything. Another officer admitted that by the second week of the air campaign, his unit had ceased all nighttime movement, preferring the risk of daytime airstrikes to the certainty of nighttime interdiction. Iraqi doctrine, built on Soviet principles of mobile defense and rapid counterattack, had assumed that friendly forces could reposition without being observed. JSTARS shattered that assumption. The American system had turned the battlefield transparent, rendering Iraqi forces visible regardless of weather, darkness, or terrain. The technological implications extended far beyond the Gulf War. JSTARS demonstrated that airborne surveillance radar could provide battlefield commanders with a level of situational awareness previously unimaginable. The system's ability to track thousands of moving targets simultaneously, distinguish between friendly and enemy forces, and provide targeting data in real time represented a paradigm shift in military intelligence. Traditional reconnaissance relied on snapshots, a satellite pass, a reconnaissance flight, a patrol report. JSTARS provided continuous surveillance, a real-time video feed of the battlefield that allowed commanders to watch enemy movements as they happened. This capability fundamentally altered the calculus of ground warfare. Defensive positions could no longer be established in secret. Reinforcement routes could not be hidden. Withdrawals became death traps. The side with superior surveillance possessed an overwhelming advantage, capable of anticipating enemy actions and preempting them with precision strikes. The development history of JSTARS reveals the challenges of creating such a system. The radar itself, a 24-foot side-looking phased array antenna, represented the cutting edge of 1980s radar technology. Unlike conventional mechanically steered radars, phased array systems used electronic beam steering, allowing the radar to track multiple targets simultaneously without moving the antenna. This electronic steering enabled JSTARS to maintain continuous surveillance over a wide area, updating target tracks every few seconds. The synthetic aperture radar mode, used for high-resolution imaging of stationary targets, employed advanced signal processing to create detailed images from radar returns. effectively turning radio waves into a camera capable of seeing through clouds, darkness, and sandstorms. The ground stations, housed in mobile shelters that could be transported by C-130 aircraft, contain the analysis and targeting workstations where Army operators manipulated radar data to produce actionable intelligence. These stations received radar data via secure data link from the airborne platform, allowing analysts on the ground to work with the same real-time information visible to operators aboard the E-8A. This ground-air integration proved critical during Desert Storm, as Army analysts at forward ground stations could communicate directly with tactical commanders, providing updates on enemy movements and coordinating airstrikes without waiting for intelligence to flow through higher headquarters. The result was a dramatically compressed decision cycle, where the time from target detection to strike execution was measured in minutes rather than hours. Iraqi attempts to counter JSTARS were ineffective because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the system. Iraqi electronic warfare units trained on Soviet doctrine attempted to jam what they believed were targeting radars aboard coalition strike aircraft. These jamming efforts had no effect on JSTARS, which operated on different frequencies and employed sophisticated anti-jamming techniques. Iraqi air defense commanders attempted to position surface-to-air missile batteries to threaten coalition reconnaissance aircraft, but JSTARS orbited well outside the range of Iraqi missile systems, safely beyond the border. Even if Iraqi forces had managed to detect the E-8A aircraft, they lacked the capability to intercept a target flying at 40,000 feet, 200 kilometers away. The system's operational concept, built around standoff surveillance from sanctuary airspace, rendered it effectively invulnerable to Iraqi countermeasures. The strategic consequences of JSTARS extended beyond tactical battlefield surveillance. The system's ability to track Iraqi ground movements allowed coalition intelligence to assess the state of Republican Guard divisions throughout the air campaign, measuring attrition rates, identifying withdrawal routes, and predicting Iraqi defensive dispositions. This intelligence informed General Schwarzkopf's decision to launch the ground offensive on February 24, 1991. Coalition commanders knew with high confidence that Iraqi forces were degraded, demoralized, and incapable of sustained resistance. JSTARS had provided the evidence. When coalition ground forces crossed the border, they advanced against an enemy whose maneuver capability had been systematically destroyed, whose command and control had been disrupted, and whose morale had collapsed under the weight of relentless surveillance and precision strikes. The experience of Desert Storm validated a concept that would define American military doctrine for the next 3 decades: information dominance as a force multiplier. JSTARS was not a weapon system in the traditional sense. It destroyed no targets directly, yet its contribution to coalition victory was arguably greater than any strike aircraft, tank, or artillery battery. By providing commanders with real-time intelligence on enemy movements, JSTARS enabled the entire coalition air campaign to operate with unprecedented efficiency. Strike aircraft did not patrol randomly, hoping to encounter targets. They were vectored directly to moving convoys, guided by controllers aboard the E-8A who could see the battlefield in real time. This targeting efficiency multiplied the effectiveness of coalition air power, allowing a finite number of aircraft to inflict disproportionate damage on Iraqi ground forces. The lessons learned from JSTARS deployment influenced subsequent development of the production model E-8C aircraft, which entered service in the late 1990s. The production variant incorporated lessons from Desert Storm, including enhanced radar processing, improved data link systems, and expanded crew stations for additional operators. The system saw extensive use in subsequent conflicts, including Operation Joint Endeavor in Bosnia, Operation Allied Force in Kosovo, and both Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns. In each theater, JSTARS provided the same capability it had demonstrated in Desert Storm: continuous, real-time surveillance of ground movements, allowing commanders to track enemy forces and direct precision strikes with minimal delay. The technological lineage of JSTARS influenced development of subsequent surveillance platforms, including unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with synthetic aperture radar and ground-moving target indicator capabilities. The concept of persistent surveillance, proven effective in Desert Storm, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. Modern reconnaissance systems, from Predator drones to Global Hawk unmanned aircraft, trace their operational concepts directly to the JSTARS experience. The idea that commanders should possess real-time awareness of enemy movements, that the battlefield should be transparent rather than obscured, became an expectation rather than an aspiration. For Iraqi forces, the experience of fighting under JSTARS surveillance was a strategic education in the futility of resisting an enemy with information dominance. Post-war assessments by Iraqi officers uniformly cited coalition air power and reconnaissance as the decisive factors in their defeat. The inability to move without being observed, to reposition without being targeted, to execute basic military maneuvers without suffering catastrophic losses, destroyed Iraqi combat effectiveness more thoroughly than any direct engagement. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy who could see everything, who appeared to anticipate every Iraqi action, eroded morale and shattered unit cohesion. By the time coalition ground forces crossed the border, many Iraqi units had already ceased functioning as effective military formations, paralyzed by the knowledge that any movement would be detected and destroyed. The broader implications of JSTRS for military doctrine are difficult to overstate. The system demonstrated that ground maneuver, the foundation of military strategy for centuries, could be rendered obsolete by sufficiently advanced surveillance. An army that cannot move undetected cannot defend effectively, cannot counterattack, cannot execute the mobile operations that define modern combined arms warfare. JSTARS revealed that in a conflict between an adversary with advanced airborne surveillance and one without, the outcome was predetermined. The side with superior information possessed an insurmountable advantage, capable of destroying enemy forces piecemeal, intercepting movements before they could be completed, and denying the enemy any sanctuary from observation. The deployment of JSTARS to Desert Storm, rushed into combat before the system was fully mature, represented a gamble that paid extraordinary dividends. General Schwarzkopf's decision to demand deployment of an experimental system, overriding concerns about reliability and readiness, demonstrated strategic insight into the decisive role that intelligence and surveillance would play in modern warfare. The success of JSTARS validated the concept of joint service development, proving that integrating Air Force and Army requirements into a single system could produce capabilities neither service could achieve independently. The operational experience gained during Desert Storm accelerated the maturation of the JSTARS program, transforming a developmental prototype into a production system that would serve for decades. In the final analysis, JSTARS represents a watershed moment in military technology, a system that fundamentally altered the nature of ground warfare by making the battlefield transparent. Iraqi Republican Guard commanders who believed they could maneuver under cover of darkness discovered that nighttime offered no concealment, that every vehicle movement was tracked, that traditional doctrines of mobile defense had become obsolete. The E-8A aircraft circling high above the desert, its radar scanning hundreds of square kilometers, had transformed ground warfare into a one-sided contest where information dominance translated directly into battlefield superiority. The coalition's ability to see everything, to track every movement, to anticipate every Iraqi action, rendered resistance futile and demonstrated that in modern warfare, knowledge is not merely power, it is survival. The Iraqis learned that lesson at a cost measured in thousands of destroyed vehicles, shattered divisions, and the collapse of a military doctrine built on assumptions that JSTARS had rendered obsolete. The United States proved that a single reconnaissance platform, when deployed with sufficient technological sophistication and operational integration, could decide the outcome of a war before the first tank crossed the border.